All right, let's talk about Anubis, the ancient Egyptian god of funerary rites. You've given me some really interesting stuff about him, and I'm ready to jump in.
Yeah, it is fascinating, isn't it, how a figure, often pictured with that jackal head can be so important to the ancient Egyptians. Like, there's just so much more to him than just a scary image.
Right, and that's what I'm hoping we can get into today. Like, let's start with that jackal imagery. Why a jackal? What did our sources say about that?
So, if we think about early ancient Egypt, there was actually a pretty practical reason for that. Egyptians, they buried their dead in these shallow graves. And those graves, well, they kind of attracted jackals, right? Jackals looking for a quick, easy meal.
So Anubis, the jackal-headed god, was like a way to fight back against like real jackals messing with the burial sites.
Exactly. It was like fighting fire with fire. They believed a powerful jackal god could keep those scavengers away. The sources actually call him the one who is upon his mountain, referring to his role as protector of the necropolis.
Okay, so he's like the original graveyard guardian.
Yeah.
But it doesn't stop there, right? His role changes and grows. What else did you find about that?
As the Egyptians' beliefs got more complex, so did Anubis's place in their whole system. Osiris eventually becomes the main underworld figure, but Anubis is still super important, especially in getting souls ready for the afterlife.
So he went from like graveyard security to like spiritual guide.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. He was seen as the guide for souls going to the afterlife. And there's another really cool thing. Anubis is also seen as this amazing embalmer. It says right here that he's described as he who is in the place of embalming.
Oh yeah, I remember that from the myth of Osiris, where Anubis helps Isis embalm Osiris after he dies.
Exactly. And that myth shows how important he is to the whole mummification process. The Egyptians believed that preserving the body was key for the soul's journey to the afterlife. Like, it wasn't just about stopping the body from decaying, but actually getting it ready for a whole new existence.
Which brings us to the scene that always kind of gives me chills: the weighing of the heart.
Full of drama, full of suspense, and it really captures how important justice was to the Egyptians, right? Like, your actions in this life directly affect what happens after you die.
Okay, so can you like set the scene for our listener? For anyone who hasn't come across it before.
So imagine this huge scale. Anubis, the jackal-headed figure, he's standing right next to it. On one side of the scale, you got the heart of the deceased, which represents their actions in life. And on the other side, you have the feather of Mot.
Okay, hold on. Tell me more about Ma. Who is she, and why is her feather so important?
So Mot, she's truth, justice, cosmic order. She's like a core concept for the Egyptians, not just a goddess. And her feather, well, that represents everything she stands for, the very principles that ruled their universe.
Whoa, so the heart is literally being weighed against like truth and righteousness. That's pretty intense.
Yeah. It's a very, very powerful image of judgment. If the heart was heavier than the feather, meaning it was, weighed down by bad deeds, well, the consequences were pretty bad.
And this is where Amit comes in, right? That soul-devouring creature.
Exactly. Mit, this terrifying creature, crocodile head, lion body, hippopotamus hindquarters. She was waiting for those whose hearts, well, didn't pass the test. The embodiment of punishment, the complete destruction of the soul.
Wow. That's definitely an image that stays with you. Makes you think about the choices you make.
Right. The ancient Egyptians were serious about living a good life, but it's important to remember Anubis, even with his role in this whole dramatic scene, he wasn't like an evil force.
What do you mean?
Well, he wasn't about, just punishing people for the sake of it. He was about making sure the transition to the afterlife was done right, making sure the right rituals were followed and that justice was served. He actually offered hope for a fair judgment and a chance to enter the afterlife properly. Remember, they also call him the protector of the divine booths, which refers to those structures they used for embalming.
So more like a guardian of balance then, making sure everything followed, cosmic law.
Exactly. Order, not just doom and gloom. He helped souls transition smoothly and fairly into the afterlife, which, by the way, the Egyptians saw as a continuation, not an ending.
Okay, so we talked about Anubis in the afterlife, but what about like his presence in the world of the living? How did they depict him in their art and stuff like that?
Well, Anubis is one of the most common figures in Egyptian art. You see him everywhere. Tombs, temples, everyday objects, everything. He's just woven into their whole civilization.
And that black color they always use for him.
So it's not just about the jackal's fur, right? Black meant a lot to them. It was regeneration, life, the fertile soil of the Nile, the lifeblood of their whole civilization. And it also symbolized the transformation of the body after embalming, which, Anubis oversaw.
So not just death, but also rebirth and renewal. For a culture so focused on the afterlife.
Yeah. Death was a transition, a change, not the end. And that black color really captures that idea.
You mentioned earlier how Osiris took on a bigger role in the underworld. So what happened to Anubis? Was he pushed aside?
No, not at all. Anubis was still key, especially as the embalming god. It even says here that Anubis wrapped the body of Osiris, meaning he's the one who actually did the mummification. Even the king of the underworld needed Anubis to get to the afterlife.
Well, that really shows how important he was.
Mm-hmm.
Even with other gods, he was still essential because of his skills and his duties.
Yeah. And don't forget, he wasn't just about the practical stuff. He was also really involved in the spiritual side of getting souls ready for the afterlife.
And speaking of that journey, what about the weighing of the heart? Like if we think of that, and Anubis is a guide, how do those two things work together? Was he like a harsh judge or more of a compassionate, shepherd?
That's a great question. It gets to the core of who Anubis really was.
And that leads us to a question for you, our listener.
Yeah, it's a question worth thinking about for sure. Was Anubis just there to judge and, condemn, or was there something more to what he was doing?
Yeah, like it's easy to just focus on a myth. That scary creature waiting to gobble up souls. But I wonder if Anubis had, like, a softer side in all this.
I think you're right. Remember, for the Egyptians, the afterlife wasn't just a reward or punishment. It was a continuation of life, but in a different form, right?
Yeah.
And they had to be ready for that. And part of getting ready meant looking at your actions in this life.
So it wasn't about, like, punishing people, but helping them see the consequences of their choices and prepare for what comes next.
Exactly. Accountability, reflection, a chance to become pure and successfully transition to the afterlife.
That makes a lot of sense. Fits with the whole guide idea, right? Not just a judge. He was helping souls through a tough, important process, not just, condemn them.
Right. And remember, he's also called the foremost of the Westerners, referring to the West as the land of the dead. So he's not some distant figure. He's actively involved in guiding souls through this whole difficult transition.
Yeah, and it makes you think about Mott in a new way, too. It wasn't just, like, rules, but a whole way of life, right? Help you find balance and harmony, not just in life, but in the afterlife, too.
Absolutely. Mott wasn't just about following rules. It was about living in harmony with the universe, with truth and justice. And Anubis, as a protector of that order, he helped souls understand and live by those ideas.
You mentioned earlier how often Anubis pops up in Egyptian art. How did they actually depict him, and what did those images say about his role?
Well, you often see him standing tall, jackal head held high, showing his watchfulness, right? Sometimes he's taking care of a mummy, showing he's a protector of the dead. And of course, you see him in the weighing of the heart scenes, as that guardian of justice.
Oh, right. Like in Tutankhamun's tomb, there's that amazing image of Anubis looking after the king's sarcophagus. Such a powerful image.
Yeah, it really is. It perfectly shows Anubis as a guardian, making sure the king gets to the afterlife safely.
What about those priests that, served Anubis? The ones who wore those incredible jackal masks during rituals. Our outline mentioned talking about them, but I haven't heard anything about that yet. What did you find in the excerpts?
Oh yeah, the priests of Anubis. They were super important in ancient Egypt. They were the ones doing all those complicated rituals for death and mummification. And the masks, well, that was their way of becoming Anubis, channeling his power and authority in those sacred ceremonies.
Yeah, those masks were amazing. I can only imagine what it was like for people seeing those rituals, those figures with jackal heads moving around, performing those ancient rites.
That's been really something. They were bringing the god to life, being the connection between the living world and the world of the dead.
It's amazing how deeply Anubis was a part of their religion. From, like, big tomb decorations to those intimate rituals, he was everywhere.
It shows how important Anubis was to their whole worldview. He wasn't just some background character. He was a central figure guiding them through life's most important change.
We've talked about how Anubis's role changed as the Egyptian beliefs changed. But what about when they met other civilizations, like the Greeks? Did Anubis ever interact with their gods?
Great question. And that brings us to Hermanubis. Remember him? So during the Ptolemaic period, when Greek rulers ran Egypt, Their cultures started mixing, even their religions. And Anubis came out of that mix. He's a combination of Anubis and the Greek god Hermes.
Whoa, wait, so even the gods weren't safe from cultural exchange? That's wild.
Shows how beliefs change and grow, even when it comes to something as basic as the afterlife, right? Hermanubis represents two totally different cultures coming together. Shows that humans everywhere want to understand what happens after we die, no matter where we come from.
That fusion of Anubis and Hermes, it brings up some interesting questions. What does it tell us about how the Greeks and Egyptians saw the afterlife? Were there like similarities in their beliefs, even though their gods were so different?
You're right. It shows this universal need to figure out what happens after death. Even with their different stories and gods, both cultures were wrestling with the same questions about death, judgment, the journey of the soul.
And Anubis, with his, many roles, guide, protector, guardian of justice, he seems to have like resonated with the Greeks too, leading to this combo god.
Exactly. It suggests that even with their differences, they had similar fears and hopes about the afterlife. They crossed cultural lines.
This whole exploration of Anubis is making me rethink how I see ancient Egypt. I used to think they were like obsessed with death, but now I see it as them really invested in life, living a life that would lead to a successful transition to the next stage.
Yeah, I think you're right. They weren't morbid, they were practical and very spiritual. They wanted to understand the mysteries of life and find their place in the universe.
And Anubis, with his complex and changing role, he represents that. He's not just about death. He's a guide, a protector, helping souls on their journey.
He shows us that death, while a part of life, isn't something to be scared of. It can be a transition, a change, maybe even a beginning.
And speaking of change, there's one more part of Anubis' story I think we should talk about. We've focused a lot on the spiritual stuff, but there's this practical element we haven't really gotten into. Well, we talked about those jackals messing with the graves and how that made Anubis a protector. But there's another level to that protection that I find really, really interesting.
I'm all ears.
We talked about how Anubis protected the dead from those jackals, right? But his role as guardian, it goes way beyond just scaring off, scavengers.
Ah, you mean like protecting the tomb itself, the actual place where they buried the dead?
Yeah. The Egyptians, they really believed that the body was super important for the soul to survive in the afterlife. Mummification, it wasn't just like symbolic. It was key to the soul keeping on going.
Right. The tomb where they put a preserved body, it became like an extension of the person, a place for their spirit to hang out and receive offerings.
And that's where Anubis as a protector gets even more interesting. He wasn't just guarding against like spiritual threats, but physical ones too.
You mean keeping robbers out of the tombs?
Exactly. The tombs, they often had like treasure and offerings, right? They were like prime targets for grave robbers. And Anubis, well, he was in charge of protecting all that stuff too, protecting the physical things just as much as the soul.
Oh, that makes total sense. He was making sure the tomb and everything in it was safe?
It really shows how the Egyptians thought about the afterlife, right? It was like a continuation of life here with both spiritual and material needs.
It shows how complex their idea of the afterlife was. Thought about everything. The soul, the body, the possessions, and Anubis. He was there to make sure it was all taken care of.
He was a busy guy. He guided souls, oversaw mummification, made sure judgment was fair, protected the physical remains. That's a lot.
It really shows just how vital he was to their entire belief system. He wasn't just a god of death, he was a god of transition, of continuity, making sure things move smoothly between the world of the living and the world of the dead.
And in a way, that kind of makes him a comforting figure, don't you think? Knowing that there was someone, even a god, looking after all of that must have been reassuring.
Definitely. He brought a sense of order and safety to something that's ultimately unknown, right? He was always there watching over everything, making sure the journey to the afterlife was as smooth and complete as possible.
This whole exploration of Anubis has been so fascinating. We saw how his role went from protecting graves to guiding souls, embalming, guarding justice, and even protecting treasure.
He's really an incredible figure. He represents just how deep and complex the ancient Egyptian understanding of life and death was, and how connected those two things were for them.
He reminds us that death, although it's part of life, it doesn't have to be scary. It can be a transition, a change, even a new start.
And with Anubis as our guide, we can face that change with understanding, acceptance, and maybe even a little bit of hope.
Thanks for joining us on this journey through ancient Egypt. We hope you learned something new about Anubis and all the beliefs that surrounded him.
And until next time, may you find peace and understanding as you explore the mysteries of life and death.